press room was a boiling pot of noise and anticipation, the kind of thick tension you could almost taste in the air. Reporters jostled for position, their cameras ready, their pens poised above notepads, as if the next sentence from his mouth would rewrite history. The bright white lights overhead felt almost surgical, stripping away every shadow, exposing every bead of sweat. In the center of it all stood Muhammad Ali. Not just a man, not just a fighter, but a presence that filled every inch of the room. He wasn't in boxing trunks today. Instead, he wore a perfectly tailored dark suit, crisp white shirt, and a tie that caught the light with every movement. His stance was relaxed, but his eyes burned with a quiet storm. There was no fidgeting, no nervous shifting of weight. He stood there like a man who had already decided the outcome of the day, regardless of what anyone in that room might write or say. When the questions came, they were rapid fire, sharp, loaded. Are you saying you won't serve? Do you understand the consequences of refusing the draft? What makes you think you're above the law? Ali let them finish. Then, with a voice that carried the weight of every street he'd walked and every punch he'd thrown, he said, "My fight is not over there. My enemy is not in Vietnam. You can't expect me to go kill people who've never done me any harm. I've said before and I'll say it again, I'm not afraid to pay the price for what I believe in." The words hung in the air like a slow-moving storm. A few reporters kept scribbling. Some froze entirely, and others simply stared, as if realizing they were watching something far bigger than a boxing headline. This wasn't about sports anymore. This was about a man choosing his conscience over his career, his principles over his freedom. But inside Ali's head, the noise of the room was far away. He was drifting back to another time, another fight, one that had nothing to do with gloves or belts. He could still see the cracked sidewalks of Louisville, smell the faint diesel exhaust from passing buses, feel the cheap fabric of the jacket he wore when he was just 12 years old. He could see the empty space where his stolen bicycle had been. That theft had left him standing in the police station, a furious kid spitting out promises of what he'd do if he found the thief. And the officer looked down at him and said, "Son, if you're going to do that, you'd better learn how to fight first." It wasn't just advice, it was a spark, a key turned in the lock of his life's door. That single sentence led him to the tiny, humid boxing gym with his peeling paint and the heavy scent of leather and sweat. He remembered slipping his hands into a pair of gloves for the first time, feeling their weight, feeling the raw connection between fist and will. Punch by punch, round by round, he learned that the ring wasn't just a place for fighting, it was a place of becoming. And that same stubborn boy who refused to quit in the gym was now the man refusing to kneel in front of a war he didn't believe in. The connection was unshakable. The rules had never been written for him, and he'd never cared to follow someone else's script. When the government stripped him of his boxing license, they thought they'd silence him. But silence doesn't kill a voice that was born to echo. He stayed in shape, shadowboxed in empty rooms, his feet gliding over bare floors, his fists striking the air with the same conviction as if a crowd were watching. Every jab, every hook was a silent declaration. I'm still here. I'm still me. Years later, when he finally returned to the ring, the cheers were deafening. But to Ali, the noise didn't matter. He fought that night not just for a title, but for the truth he had carried through years of exile. And every punch he threw was proof that a man who stands for something cannot be broken by anyone. Decades after that day in the press room, when the arena lights dimmed and the ring was empty, his voice could still be heard in the silence, rolling through the darkness with the same unshakable rhythm. I am the greatest because I believed. The roar of the crowd had been replaced by something far more deafening: silence. No ring, no lights, no chance of Ali, Ali. Just the sound of his own breath echoing in the small apartment where he now trained alone. His title was gone, his license stripped, and his name dragged through every newspaper in the country. To many, he was no longer the champ. To some, he was a traitor. But to Muhammad Ali, this exile wasn't the end. It was a test, one he intended to pass on his terms. The morning started early, before the sun could pierce the blinds. His body still remembered the rhythm of camp, the road work, the bag drills, the sparring. Only now, the sparring was with shadows. He would glide across the worn carpet of his living room, The furniture pushed aside to make space, his feet whispering across the floor. His fists sliced through the stale air with precision. Every movement was as sharp as if he had a fight scheduled tomorrow. But there was no fight, not for years. And that was the battle, not the physical one, but the mental war of staying sharp when the world told you to sit down and disappear. Some nights, lying in bed, he could hear the echo of ringside bells in his head, a ghost of the life stolen from him. There were days when doubt tried to creep in, when the quiet pressed down on him like a weight. But that's when the voice inside him would speak. The same voice that rose up when he was a boy in Louisville. The same voice that told him rules were meant to be challenged. Outside, the country was on fire. Protests, riots, assassinations. America was changing, bleeding, tearing at the seams. And through it all, Ali became more than a fighter. He became a symbol. Universities invited him to speak. Young men, fearful of the draft, looked to him as proof that you could stand your ground. His words cut through the noise like his punches once had through the guard of an opponent. One day, as he stood before a packed college auditorium, a student asked, "Don't you regret losing the best years of your career for this?" Ali paused, letting the question settle, scanning the room. "If I traded my beliefs in my career," he said, "then I'd lose more than the best years of my life. I'd lose myself." The room erupted in applause, but Ali didn't smile. He meant every word, and he knew the applause wouldn't bring back the time he'd lost. At night, he still trained. The skipping rope slapped the floor in perfect rhythm. The speed bag rattled against his platform, and the heavy bag swayed with every thunderous blow. He wasn't preparing for a fight he could see. He was preparing for the day he'd walk back into the ring and remind the world who he was. And when that day finally came, when the bell rang again and the crowd's roar returned like a wave crashing over him, he didn't just hear cheers. He heard years of silence breaking apart. He stepped forward, light on his feet, eyes locked, body alive with the electricity of everything he had endured. He was back, and he hadn't changed a single rule. The lights above the ring blazed like a second sun, their heat mingling with the electric fever of the crowd. It had been years since Muhammad Ali had walked this path, the long, slow approach from the locker room to the squared circle. But tonight, it felt both foreign and familiar. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, popcorn, and anticipation. People leaned over the rails, shouting his name, some with tears in their eyes, others with pure disbelief that he was here at all. He moved with the same effortless glide that had once baffled opponents and enchanted fans. His white robe, trimmed in gold, shimmered under the floodlights. The words "the greatest" stitched across the back weren't a boast tonight. They were a reminder, not to the crowd, to himself. As he stepped through the ropes, the noise swelled into something alive, something that seemed to pulse with his heartbeat. He scanned the arena slowly, letting the energy sink in. Across the ring, his opponent was a wall of muscle, younger, hungry, and eager to prove that time had passed Ali by. The man's eyes locked onto him, hard and unblinking. Ali didn't look away. Instead, he smiled that half-mocking, half-promising grin that had once gotten inside a fighter's head before the first punch was thrown. The bell hadn't even rung, and yet the fight had already begun. When it did ring, the first round was a storm of movement. Ali's feet were poetry in motion, his body swaying, pivoting, slipping punches by inches. He tapped the air with his jab, not to score points, but to measure, to test, to let his opponent know exactly how far he could reach, and that he could reach him anytime he wanted. The crowd roared at every feint, every slick sidestep. They weren't just watching a fight. They were watching a resurrection. But it wasn't easy. The years away had cost him speed, and the man in front of him was relentless. Heavy shots thudded into Ali's arms and ribs, each one carrying the weight of youth and ambition. The audience gasped when a hook glanced off his jaw, but Ali didn't back away. Instead, he leaned in just enough to whisper something his opponent would never forget. "You can hit hard, but you can't hit truth." By the middle rounds, the fight had turned into something primal, not just a contest of fists, but of wills. The younger fighter pressed forward, hoping to break him down. Ali leaned on the ropes, absorbing the punishment, the infamous rope-a-dope strategy coming alive before their eyes. with every punch his opponent threw. Ali was calculating, waiting, letting the storm wear itself out. And then, when the time was right, he struck. The combination was pure art. A lightning jab, a right cross, another jab, and a hook that landed with the kind of sound you feel in your bones. The crowd erupted, the momentum shifting in an instant. Every punch after that was a reminder. This was no comeback story. This was a man taking back what was his. As the final bell rang, both men stood in the center of the ring, chests heaving, sweat dripping, eyes locked. The decision was almost irrelevant. The victory had happened the moment Ali had stepped through those ropes. But when the referee raised his hand, the arena exploded. He had returned on his own terms, and the world had been forced to remember. Somewhere in the noise, Ali's smile widened. This wasn't just a win. It was proof. The air in the Philippines was heavy, almost oppressive, clinging to skin like a wet blanket. Even at night, the humidity seemed to press down on everyone in the arena, from the ticket holders in the front row to the sweat-soaked men in the corners. But no one felt it more than the two men about to step into the ring for what would be remembered as the Thriller in Manila. Ali paced in his dressing room, his robe open, the fabric damp from the heat. His team worked quietly, wrapping hands, massaging shoulders, but their eyes gave away what they were feeling. They knew this fight was more than a title defense. This was the final act of a bitter rivalry, the kind of contest that etched itself into history long after the belts and trophies faded. Across the arena, Joe Frazier was doing the same, his own silence matching the weight of the moment. When Ali walked down the narrow corridor toward the ring, the sound of the crowd hit him like a wave. It wasn't just cheering. It was a wall of noise, a living organism feeding on the anticipation of what was about to happen. The ring glowed under the harsh spotlights, a small island of white canvas in the middle of a sea of bodies. The first round was a study in contrasts. Ali came out light on his feet, flicking his jab, talking, taunting, making Frazier work for every inch. Frazier, eyes narrowed, kept moving forward, his head bobbing, shoulders rolling, throwing hooks that landed with a thud you would feel in your chest. By the middle rounds, the fight had turned into a furnace. The heat in the ring was unbearable, and the pace was relentless. Sweat poured off both men like rain, soaking the canvas, blurring vision, making every step a battle against exhaustion. Ali leaned into the ropes, letting Frazier unload. The rope-a-dope, a dangerous gamble in this heat. Every punch that landed sent shockwaves through his arms and ribs, but he absorbed it, knowing that somewhere in the chaos, there would be a moment to turn the tide. He whispered between clenched teeth, "Is that all you got, Joe?" and watched as the fire in Frazier's eyes flared even hotter. Round after round, they punished each other. The crowd stopped roaring and started gasping, realizing they were witnessing something raw and almost primal. By the 14th round, both men were shadows of themselves, but neither would yield. Ali's punches were slower, but they still found their mark, snapping Frazier's head back again and again. When the bell rang to end the round, Frazier's corner made a decision no fighter ever wants to hear. They wouldn't let him come out for the 15th. Ali slumped on his stool, utterly spent. He didn't jump up, didn't raise his arms in triumph. He later said it was the closest he'd ever felt to death in the ring. But as the referee lifted his hand, the crowd roared again and Ali's eyes searched for Frazier's. In that brief exchange, there was no taunting, no rivalry, only the mutual respect of two men who had given and taken more than anyone thought humanly possible. And as he left the ring that night, the Philippine air still heavy around him. Ali knew this fight wasn't just part of his legacy. It was his legacy. The roar of Manila still echoed in his mind long after the crowd had gone home. But the years that followed were not the same kind of battles. The opponents changed. The arena changed. The fight, however, never ended. Muhammad Ali was still the greatest. But the mirror began to tell a different truth. The once smooth glide at his feet felt heavier. His reflexes, once lightning, now carried a fraction of delay. Every fight seemed to take more out of him, as if the ring was slowly collecting a debt for all the nights he had cheated defeat. And yet he refused to stop. The roar of the crowd, the bright lights, the rhythm of the bell, these were part his blood. But behind closed doors, away from cameras and reporters, he began to notice the tremors. At first, they were faint, just a slight shake in his hands after a long day. Then they grew persistent, creeping into the steady control he had once mastered. He brushed it off, convinced it was just fatigue, another battle scar from years of war inside the ropes. His inner circle saw the changes, the softer speech, the slower step, but no one dared suggest he step away completely. Ali had built his life on defying expectations, and retirement was just another opponent trying to beat him before the final bell. Even as Parkinson's began to take hold, Ali didn't hide. He stepped onto stages, visited hospitals, stood before children, shaking hands that no longer had the same firmness but carried the same sincerity. The world saw the disease, but they also saw the man who refused to let it define him. He became something beyond a boxer, a symbol of resilience, grace, and the dignity of a fighter who still stood tall, even as his body betrayed him. One of his most defining moments outside the ring came in 1996, at the Olympic Games in Atlanta. The stadium lights blazed, the crowd holding its breath as he appeared, torch in hand. His right arm trembled, the flame flickering in the night air. And yet, in that tremor, the entire world saw unshakable courage. The same boy from Louisville, the same man who stood against war, the same champion who danced in the ring, was now lighting a flame that would burn the memory of millions. As the years passed, the public appearances grew fewer. But when he did step into the light, the reverence was palpable. People didn't just see a former champion. They saw a life lived without compromise, a man who had kept his own rules from beginning to end. And in the quiet moments, surrounded by family, he would still smile that same smile, the one that had unnerved opponents and charmed the world. Because deep down, even with the tremors, even with the battles he could no longer win in the physical sense, he knew the truth. A fighter's greatest victory is not measured in belts or knockouts, but in the refusal to surrender the core of who you are. By the time the final years of his life approached, Muhammad Ali had long since crossed the boundary between athlete and legend. The arenas were gone, the gloves hung up, but the world still leaned forward whenever his name was spoken. His presence had shifted. No longer the lightning blur in the ring, but a quiet force, like a great river that still shapes the land long after the storm has passed. He traveled less, yet when he did, it was as if entire cities paused to greet him. Heads of state shook his hand. Celebrities stood in awe, and strangers who had never seen him fight still felt compelled to thank him. They weren't thanking him for the knockouts, the titles, or even the unforgettable trash talk. They were thanking him for what he had stood for keeping his spine straight when the world tried to bend it. In Louisville, the streets he once ran as a boy now bore his name. Murals painted him larger than life, a reminder to the next generation that greatness is not something given, it's something forged. He became a living history lesson, proof that conviction can outlast muscle, and that a man's character is a true measure of his strength. But his body, faithful for so many years of battle, continued to betray him. The Parkinson's tremors grew more pronounced, his speech softer, his movements slower. Yet even in this, he refused to disappear. At charity events, he'd smile through the effort it took to stand, to wave, to sign a shaky autograph. At children's hospitals, he'd pull a magic trick from his pocket, a coin that vanished, a card that appeared in his palm, and watch their faces light up. It wasn't about showing them Muhammad Ali, the champion. It was about showing them Muhammad Ali, the man. Then came June 3rd, 2016. The news spread across the world like a sudden shadow. Muhammad Ali had passed away at the age of 74. Television screens lit up with his fights, his speeches, his interviews. Old rivals, sports legends, world leaders, and ordinary fans poured out their memories. Social media became a river of black and white photos, iconic quotes, and a single unshakable truth. There would never be another like him. In Louisville, tens of thousands lined the streets for his funeral procession. The hearse moved slowly past cheering. Weeping crowds who reached out as if they could touch the legend one last time. Strangers embraced, united in loss, their voices mixing in chants of Ali, Ali. The procession ended at Cave Hill Cemetery, where his grave would rest beneath a simple headstone, humble for a man whose shadow stretched across the globe. And yet, his voice seemed to linger in the air, a whisper carried on every breeze. I am the greatest because I believed. Muhammad Ali's gloves may have been set down forever, but the fight he fought, for dignity, for conviction, for the courage to live by one's own rules, would never end. Because legends aren't just remembered. They are carried forward, piece by piece, in the hearts of those who dare to stand as he did. Under a sky of soft gray clouds, the streets of Louisville were alive with a sound that was neither entirely sorrow nor celebration. It was something in between, something deeper. Tens of thousands stood shoulder to shoulder, lining the route where Muhammad Ali would make his final journey home. Some held signs of his famous quotes, others clutched old, worn photographs, and more than a few simply pressed their hands to their hearts as the slow, black hearse approached. Children sat on the shoulders of parents, straining to see over the crowd, not because they had witnessed his fights, but because they had grown up in the shadow of his name. The procession moved slowly, as if the city itself refused to rush him. Every block was a chapter of his life. The old gym where he had first laced up gloves, the air once thick with the smell of leather and sweat, now stood silent, its windows lined with flowers. The neighborhood streets where a young Cassius Clay had raced his bicycle were now packed with strangers who chanted, Ali, Ali, with the same rhythm that had once echoed through boxing arenas. In the hearse, draped in a cascade of white roses, lay the man who had taught the world that greatness was not measured in muscle alone. The man who had looked the United States government in the eye and said, no. The man who had floated, stung, danced, and endured, and who had kept his own rules from the first day to the last. Television cameras captured every step, broadcasting it to millions across the globe. In places far from Kentucky, in Lagos, in Manila, in London, in Cairo, people stopped what they were doing to watch. They didn't see a boxer being buried. They saw a symbol being honored inside the KFC center where the memorial service was held. The air was thick with emotion. Friends, family, rivals, presidents, and strangers filled the seats. The stage was set simply, with a single photograph of Ali in his prime, gloves raised, eyes fierce. The podium stood like a ring center, and one by one, people stepped up to speak. Some shared stories of laughter, his quick wit, his endless charm, the way he could defuse tension with a single line. Others spoke of his courage, the way he had stood for his beliefs even when the cost was everything he had worked for. When his wife, Lonnie, took the stage, her voice trembled but did not break. Muhammad didn't just fight in the ring, she said. He fought for what was right. He fought for those without a voice. And even when his own voice grew quiet, his presence still spoke to the world. The ceremony ended, but the true final act came later, at Cave Hill Cemetery. The crowd had thinned, the media lights dimmed, but the quiet at the graveside was profound. A soft breeze stirred the trees, and in the stillness, it was easy to imagine his voice, that confident melodic rhythm, filling the air again. I am the greatest because I believed. And in that moment, the truth of it all crystallized. Muhammad Ali had lived as he fought, with grace, defiance, humor, and an unshakable conviction. The fights in the ring had given him belts and glory, but the fights outside the ring had given him immortality. His story didn't end in that grave. It lived in every person who had ever felt too small to stand up, but did it anyway. It lived in a young boy who decided to chase a dream no one else could see. It lived in the idea that rules can be rewritten when they stand in the way of what is right. The world would go on without him, but never unchanged. Somewhere, a kid in a quiet neighborhood would pick up a pair of gloves for the first time. Somewhere else, another would find the courage to speak against injustice. And somewhere, maybe in the hum of a distant crowd or the silence before dawn, the echo would rise again. I am the greatest because I believed. And so the man who had once floated like a butterfly and stung like a bee became something greater than the sum of his victories. He became a reminder that the truest champions are not those who never fall, but those who rise every time, in the ring and in life, and dare to live by their own rules.